Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit. Get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The hallway outside his room was wrong. Foster knew this with a bone-deep certainty that arrived each morning before the memory of his own name. It was not the color, a bland institutional beige, nor the floor, scuffed linoleum the hue of a healing bruise. It was the proportions. Some mornings, when the early light slanted in through the far window at the nurse's station, the hallway stretched into an impossible tunnel, the ceiling pressing down like a heavy palm, the walls breathing inward until the journey to the elevator seemed a voyage through a vein. Other days, it was squat and compressed, a short, claustrophobic diorama. It was never the same. His father, Ephraim, said it was the brain injury, the long coma, the wires still misfiring. But Foster felt the hallway's deceit in his gut, a seasick lurch of reality itself refusing to hold its shape. The coma had lasted 2 years. He had left a world of soft edges and returned to one of terrifying clarity and constant, silent noise. It wasn't sound, it was knowledge. It came through touch. The first time, a young nurse named Lacey had adjusted his ivory door. Her fingers, cool and efficient, brushed his wrist. A cascade of images, scent and feeling, flooded him. The nurse as a girl, crying over a dead kitten in a shoebox, the smell of wet earth, her last boyfriend's hand gripping her arm too tight, the coppery taste of fear, and then a clear, cold vision of her, older, in a blue dress, standing by a graveside under a maple tree. He had jerked back, crying out. She had apologized, thinking she'd hurt him. Ephraim, a man whose love had worn itself into a permanent state of gentle worry, became his anchor. He spent every day in the room that smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers, reading newspapers aloud, his voice a steady drone against the silent static of the hospital. He believed Foster, or wanted to. It's a gift, son, he'd say, his own hand carefully gloved when he helped Foster walk the shifting hallway. A hard one, but a gift. You see the truth of things, but the truth was a burden of lead and glass. He saw the cheating husband in the kindly doctor's past, the secret abortion haunting the cheerful nutritionist, the childhood abuse that made the security guard flinch at sudden movements. He saw futures, too. Petty triumphs, quiet despairs, a car crash, a lottery win, a diagnosis still years away. They were fragments, shards of a mirror reflecting a million different lives, and he had to walk barefoot through them all. And he saw Kaya. Not in person, but in the ghost limb ache of his own memories, and in the echoes of her left behind in his old apartment, which Ephraim had kept, a museum of a life paused. He had touched a sweater she'd forgotten, and the past had roared back. The scent of her coconut shampoo, the sound of her laugh against his neck, the specific warmth of her skin at 3 in the morning. But the touch showed the end too, her visits to his comatose body, growing less frequent, her hope thinning to a thread, then snapping. He saw her meeting someone else. A man with an easy smile and no ghosts in his eyes. He saw her happy. It was the most devastating vision of all. He was released into a world grown alien. Colors were too vivid, sounds too sharp, and every crowd was a cacophony of screaming histories and whispering futures. He became a recluse in his preserved apartment, curtains drawn, wearing thick workman's gloves. Ephraim was his only tether, a man growing older and wearier. His own future, a dim, sad picture, Foster could not bring himself to fully examine. The authorities came, of course. A psychologist from the state, a weary man with nicotine-stained fingers who spoke of post-traumatic psychosis. A researcher from a university, her eyes bright with a clinical hunger, wanting to test, to quantify. Foster, to make them leave, took the researcher's hand. He saw her pilfering data from the project, her professional ruin, the lonely cats that would outlive her. He described it in a flat, quiet voice. She left and never returned. They labeled him a sensitive, a good guesser, a traumatized man. They did not believe the truth. Then came the rally. Ephraim had the news on, a constant low murmur. A man named Jordan Kane was speaking. A political figure, rising fast, speaking of renewal, of strength, of clearing away the rot. The camera closed in on his face, on his hand gripping the podium. Foster, passing by the screen, felt a jolt, a sympathetic vibration in his teeth. He had to see. He had to touch. He knew it was impossible. But the vision had begun without contact, a crack in his shielding. He begged Ephraim to take him to a rally, just to be near. Ephraim, his face etched with new dread, refused, then relented, as he always did. The rally was in a convention center. The air buzzed with a fervent, anxious energy. From the back of the crowd, Foster watched Jordan Kane. He was charismatic, his voice an instrument of piercing sincerity. But Foster saw other things. A strange, cold aura around him. A space the cheering seemed to bend away from. Shadows in the hall, pooling too deep, clinging to him like a second. Ragged suit. After the speech, as Kane moved through a cordoned-off area, shaking hands, Foster broke away from Ephraim's grip. He moved like a sleepwalker, through the crowd, past a startled guard, his gloved hand reaching out. His fingertips brushed the sleeve of Jordan Kane's impeccably tailored jacket. The world dissolved. It was not a stream of images, but an ocean, a black, starless cosmos of intent. He saw not a man, but a vessel. He saw a childhood of calculated cruelty, not born of pain, but of a profound, empty hunger. He saw manipulations, small and large, a trail of broken people used as stepping stones. He saw the future Kane intended, not policy or reform, but a systematic unraveling. He saw camps, not of barbed wire, but of despair, where hope was systematically drained and consumed. He saw towers of glass and steel rising from ashes, and in their reflections, no human faces. Only vast, slithering shadows that were both the source and the result of Kane's ambition. This was not a politician. This was a door, and something was about to come through. Foster stumbled back, a guttural sound caught in his throat. Kane turned. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, met Foster's. For a fraction of a second, the charming mask vanished. Foster saw the infinite hunger behind it, the cold, patient void that had seen him, that knew him. A smile, thin and sharp as a scalpel, touched Kane's lips. Then the mask was back, and he was moving on. The moral dilemma was no dilemma at all. He had to tell. He went to the authorities, to the media. He was a man with a brain injury, a psychiatric history, a story of psychic visions. They smiled with polite, dismissive eyes. They showed him the door. He wrote letters, sent emails, made frantic calls. He was a ghost shouting into a hurricane of normalcy. Only Ephraim believed, and belief became terror. "You have to stop, Foster," he pleaded one night, his hands shaking as he made tea. "He saw you. That man. He's not just a man. You're painting a target on your back." Foster saw his father's future then in the worried line of his shoulders. It was a short, dark path, ending in a heart attack, brought on by stress and fear. He could change it. He could stop. He could bury the gift, hide in the apartment, let the world turn towards its catastrophe. But the visions of Kane's future would not leave. They played behind his eyes, a silent film of ending. The shadows growing teeth, the mirrors reflecting nothing, the water in the glasses of the complacent turning thick and black. He devised a desperate plan, a public confrontation. He would force a touch on camera and speak the visions aloud, the specific, horrible details. He would make them so vivid, so unsettling, that even the skeptical would feel a chill. The opportunity came at a fundraiser. Foster, gloveless, heart hammering a dur against his ribs, waited. As Kane passed, he lunged, his bare hand aiming for the man's flesh. But Kane was expecting him. A bodyguard, a man with a face like a clenched fist, intercepted. Foster's hand landed on the bodyguard's neck. The vision was immediate and brutal. The bodyguard, as a boy, drowning a sack of puppies in a muddy pond, the feeling of their small struggles ceasing. His first kill in a desert war, the hot spray of blood on his cheek, the surprising lightness of a life leaving, and his future standing over Foster's own broken body. A faint regret. Foster recoiled, but it was too late. Kane paused, looking down at him as the guards restrained him. He leaned close, his voice a whisper of dry leaves. "I see you too, Seer," he breathed, and his breath smelled of ozone and old stone. "You are a ripple. I am the coming tide, and your little pool is about to be swallowed by the sea." Foster was arrested, charged with assault, released into Ephraim's trembling custody. The world moved on. Jordan Kane's pulse rose. The dread became a physical atmosphere in the apartment. Ephraim's worry was a constant hum. Then, one evening, the hum stopped. Foster found him in his armchair, the newspaper fallen to the floor, his face slack, eyes staring at nothing. The heart attack, just as foreseen. Foster's gift had shown him the what, but the when was a cruel, specific surprise. His anchor was gone. The last tether to the world of normal proportions was severed. The funeral was a gray affair. Kaya came. She stood at the back, her face a beautiful map of sorrow and regret. Their eyes met. He saw her future again, the happy life with the smiling man, and he also saw with a new, terrible clarity that his own presence in her past was now a closed chapter, a sad footnote. He did not approach. To touch her would be a violation. To speak to her would be to pull her into his descending nightmare. He let her go. A second, more final death. Alone in the apartment that was now a tomb, Foster understood. He could not stop the tide, but he could perhaps understand its source. He removed all the gloves. He walked through the rooms, trailing his fingers over every surface, every object Ephraim had touched. He immersed himself in the ghost of his father's love, his worry, his simple, good life. He gathered the strength. It was a ritual, a charging of his own soul. He knew where Kane would be for a crucial television interview. A studio in a downtown high-rise. Foster, armed only with his certainty, went. He bypassed security with an eerie, focused calm, his gift showing him the guards' blind spots, their routines. He stood in the shadows of the studio's green room as Kane finished his segment, the air crackling with the man's performed sincerity. As Kane walked back, alone for a moment in the soundproofed hallway, Foster stepped out. Kane stopped. He showed no surprise. "The ripple returns," he said, his voice amused. "I'm not here to stop you," Foster said, and his own voice was a stranger's, hollow and resonant. "I'm here to see you. Truly see you." Why? Before Kane could react, Foster clasped the man's face in both his bare hands. The vision was not a stream, but a plunge into an abyss. He saw back, past the man, past the childhood, into a lineage of whispers and pacts. He saw a great-grandfather in a Dust Bowl field, making a bargain with something that wore the drought as a cloak. He saw the hunger pass down, a dormant seed, flowering now in Jordan. He saw the thing behind the door, not a demon from a pit, but something older, from the spaces between stars, a consumer of potential, a devourer of futures. Cain was its key and its first course. The catastrophe was not war or tyranny, but a great unraveling, a silencing of the human song, a world left as a hollow, static stage for the shadow behind the man. And Foster saw something else, a flaw, a crack in the vessel. The hunger was absolute, but the human form was not. To channel the devourer, Cain had to be perfectly, coldly empty. And Foster, with his gift, was a conduit of pure, chaotic human experience. Memory, love, grief, hope, the very antithesis of that void. He did not try to show Cain his past or future. He poured his own into him. He gave him Ephraim's steadfast love, the crushing weight of his loss. He gave him Kaya's lost laughter, the scent of her hair. He gave him the nurse, Lacey's grief for her kitten and her future graveside sorrow. He gave him the bodyguard's fleeting regret, the taste of the nutritionist's secret relief, the doctor's shame. He gave him every shard of glass from the mirror of humanity he had been forced to walk upon. He opened the floodgates of 1 billion lives he had glimpsed and channeled it all. A tsunami of feeling into the empty vessel. Jordan Cain began to shake. His pale eyes widened, not with power, but with a terrifying, unfamiliar overload. He tried to speak, but his voice broke. A tear, the first and last of its kind, traced a path through his perfect makeup. He was not being attacked. He was being filled. And the thing behind the door, the devourer of futures, could not abide this influx of raw, messy, human past. The connection shattered. Cain did not die. He collapsed, babbling, weeping, clutching his head. The voices of 1,000 souls now screaming where there had only been silent hunger. The emptiness was gone, replaced by a cacophony he had no capacity to hold. He was irrevocably broken. Foster stood over him, empty himself. The gift was gone, burned out in that final, sacrificial surge. He felt only a vast, quiet exhaustion. The authorities found him there. They saw a broken politician and a traumatized man. Foster's story of psychic self-defense was just another delusion. They committed him, not to a hospital, but to a quieter, more permanent place. The hallway outside his room is wrong. Foster knows this with a bone-deep certainty that arrives each morning before the memory of his own name. It is not the color, a bland institutional beige, nor the floor. Scuffed linoleum, the hue of a healing bruise. It is the proportions. Some mornings, when the early light slants in through the far window at the nurse's station, the hallway stretches into an impossible tunnel, the ceiling pressing down like a heavy palm, the walls breathing inward. Other days, it is squat and compressed. It is never the same. The orderlies say it is the treatment, the quietness of his mind, the wires settling at last. But Foster feels the hallway's deceit in his gut, a seasick lurch. He sits in a chair by his door, hands in his lap, palms upturned. They are clean, inert. They hold no past, see no future. He is a blank page. Sometimes, a nurse will come to lead him to the garden. Her name is Lacey. She is kind, with cool, efficient fingers. She reminds him of someone, a ghost from a life that feels like a story he once read. He takes her offered elbow. He does not flinch from the touch. It tells him nothing at all. On the television in the common room, the news talks of a recovering politician named Jordan Cain, who speaks now in fragmented, poetic, and terrifying phrases about the weight of all the world's sorrow, who screams in the night about the shadows in the mirrors. Some call him a prophet of a new empathetic age. Others whisper of madness. Foster watches, his face placid, a still pool reflecting nothing. He is empty. He is at peace. The world outside turns, its future once more uncertain, once more its own. And in the quiet of his mind, where the visions used to scream, there is only the silent, growing certainty that the hallway outside his room will never ever be the right size again. The garden is the only place where the dimensions feel fixed. The sky is a lid, but a distant one. The fence marks a true boundary. Foster sits on a stone bench, the same one every day, and watches a single rosebush. It is a mundane, stubborn thing. It blooms, it withers, it is pruned back to knuckles. It does not whisper. It simply is. Lacey brings him his medication on a small paper cup. She watches him swallow, her eyes soft with a professional pity. He knows the routine. He is a model patient, compliant, quiet. His file, he imagines, must be thick with notes on his progressive detachment, his successful integration into the routine of non-being. One afternoon, a new orderly is on duty. A young man with a nervous smile and a tattoo peeking from his cuff. He is helping an elderly patient shuffle down the wrong hallway. The patient is confused, resistant. The orderly, frustrated, grips the old man's arm a little too tightly. Foster sees it from his bench. He feels nothing. No cascade. No story. Just the observation of pressure on thin skin. But then the orderly looks up, meets Foster's gaze, and quickly looks away. And in that flicker of averted eyes, Foster does not see a vision. He knows. He knows this man has a temper he hides. He knows he shortchanges the patients on their time in the sun. He knows it not through touch, but through a lifetime of accumulated human observation, a language he had forgotten he could speak. The gift is gone. The man remains. This is a different kind of clarity. That night in his room, he does not sleep. He listens to the silence of his own mind. It is not truly silent, he realizes. It is the silence of a library, not a tomb. The books are all there, the stories of 1,000 touches, but they are closed on their shelves. He can choose to open none of them. The peace he feels is not emptiness. It is containment. He thinks of Jordan Kane babbling on the television, a vessel filled to bursting with a chaos not his own. Foster had done that. He had not fought the void with light, but had flooded it with the ocean of human experience. He had not killed the man, but he had killed the emptiness. The devourer had found its key corrupted, its door sealed shut with the glue of 1,000,000 memories. The victory was not clean. It was a messy, human salvation. Kane's madness was the proof. The next day, when Lacey takes his elbow, he looks at her hand. He sees the faint scar on her knuckle from a childhood fall. He sees the practical short nails. He does not see her griefs or her future. He sees her, just her, and it is enough. He begins to test the edges of his new world. He watches the orderlies, the doctors, the other patients. He pieces together their stories from fragments of conversation, from worn shoes, from habits and glances. He builds understanding from the outside in, like everyone else. It is slow. It is fallible. It is human. The hallway outside his room still shifts. He accepts this now. It is not the treatment. It is the world, or his perception of it, forever altered by having seen its hidden wires. Some realities, once known, cannot be unknown. The wrongness of the hallway is the ghost of his gift, a permanent afterimage. He learns to walk it anyway, measuring his steps not by the walls, but by his own steady breath. Weeks pass, or perhaps months. Time is soft here. One evening, a special report interrupts the usual programming. Jordan Kane has disappeared from his secured care facility. There is footage of an empty room, a window open to a stormy night. The commentator speaks of tragedy, of a fragile mind lost. Foster sits very still. He feels a coldness that is not fear, but recognition. He knows, with the same bone-deep certainty that tells him the hallway is wrong, that Kane did not jump. He was taken, not by authorities or by well-wishers. The thing that had made its pact with his great-grandfather, the devourer from between the stars, had not been destroyed. Its key was broken, its door blocked. But a failed key is still a key, and a broken, screaming mind, overflowing with the very humanity it was meant to erase, might be a new kind of lure. A wound, rather than a door. Foster stands. He walks to the window of the common room. The sky outside is the color of slate. The garden below is empty. The rosebush is just a shape in the gloom. He feels the first tremor then. Not in the floor, but in the air. A subtle wrongness in the pressure. A taste like static and burnt sugar. It is faint, but it is growing. He looks down at his own hands, resting on the windowsill. They are just hands. They will not save him. They will not save anyone. But they can turn a doorknob. They can pick up a stone. They can feel the rain. The hallway outside will never be the right size. The world outside is now a different kind of wrong. And Foster, empty of visions but full of a quiet, hard-won self, knows his piece is over. The tide he thought he had turned was only the first wave. And the next one is coming. This time, he will have to meet it as only a man can. Story 2. The pendulum in the grandfather clock did not swing. It hung, a brass teardrop frozen in the dusty afternoon light of the shop. Hugh Merriweather knew this. He had known it for 37 years, since the day he sealed the clock's weights and stilled its heart as a kindness to its previous owner. A widow who said its ticking kept her awake with memories of her dead husband's footsteps. Hugh knew the pendulum was still, and yet, from his worn leather chair by the cold pot-bellied stove, he saw it, not a swing, but a shiver. A minute, impossible tremor along its edge, as if plucked by a ghostly finger. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeam beside it seemed to slow, to thicken like sap in winter. He blinked, and it was still. The shop, a cathedral of arrested time, settled back into its silence. But the silence was different now. It was not the absence of sound, but a layered thing, a palimpsest of 1,000 stolen ticks and talks. The clocks filled the room, shelf upon shelf of them, mantel clocks and carriage clocks, a regiment of porcelain-faced beauties and stern oak-cased regulators. They were all wound, all kept to time, a chorus Hugh conducted with meticulous, lonely care. Their sound was a soft, complex weave, a fabric of time itself, or so he had always felt. Now, he heard a flaw in the weave, a slight, syncopated hitch, not in one clock, but in the space between them all. The first omen was the tea. Erica, his niece, had visited that Tuesday. A brilliant, brittle woman whose world was made of certainties and equations. She brought him Darjeeling and skepticism in equal measure. She'd set her mug on the oak workbench, the steam curling in a languid ribbon. They'd argued gently about his isolation, about the dust, about selling a few pieces. She left, the mug half full. Hugh, cleaning up an hour later, watched as the thin scum of milk on the surface of the cold tea trembled, then swirled against the curve of the porcelain, a tiny, lazy vortex. There was no draft. The air was grave still. He lifted the mug and saw beneath it a perfect damp ring on the wood, and within that ring, the ghost of another, fainter ring, as if the mug had been sitting there for days, not hours. Then came the sounds, not from the clocks, but from the town. The two-note song of Mrs. Henderson's mail truck, always at 1:15 p.m., would sometimes warble, stretching into a dissonant, drawn-out cry that arrived at 1:14, or echoed again at 1:16. Children's laughter from the schoolyard would skip like a scratched record, a single shriek repeating 3-4 times, each iteration drier, more metallic than the last. Hugh began to feel a peculiar thickness in the air of his shop, a resistance to movement, as if he were wading through warm oil. His shadow, cast by the perpetually low eastern sun through the front window, would sometimes lag behind him, or worse, precede him, a black stain already waiting where he intended to step. Erica returned, not for a social call, but because her own world had developed a crack. Her lab at the university, where she studied quantum decoherence, had suffered a series of minor but inexplicable anomalies. Precise lasers lost alignment. Atomic clocks, isolated in a Faraday cage, developed picosecond discrepancies that correlated with no known error. "It's like local time is developing a tremor, Uncle Hugh," she said. Her physicist's cool, unable to mask a deeper unease. She stood midst his clocks, a stranger in a foreign land, a shiver in the arrow of time. Said, Hugh showed her the grandfather clock. He pointed to the pendulum. "It moved," he said, his voice a whisper that was swallowed by the ticking. "It hasn't moved in decades, but it did." He told her about the tea, the sounds, the shadows. She listened, not with the dismissiveness he feared, but with a dawning, horrified comprehension. She took out her phone, opened a sophisticated audio analysis app, and recorded the shop's soundscape. The waveform that scrolled across her screen was not a steady rhythm. It showed pulses, gaps, and strange, recursive loops. "They're not just keeping time, Uncle Hugh," she breathed. "They're chewing it. They're creating paradox bubbles. Tiny, localized areas where effect precedes cause, where entropy stutters." The revelation did not come in a flash, but accreted like frost. Hugh, in his desperation, sought the only other person who might understand. Irving Vale. Irving was a collector too, but of a different breed, a sharp, acquisitive man who had always coveted Hugh's finest pieces, particularly the strange, non-functional lament configuration. Pocket watch with its backwards-running numerals and interior gears that seemed to model impossible geometries. Irving received Hugh in his sterile, modern apartment, his clocks displayed like trophies in lit cases. He was not surprised. He was eager. "You felt it then," Irving said, his eyes gleaming. "The hunger. You have more of them than anyone, Merriweather. You've built a larder, and it's attracted a guest. Me." Irving spoke of the entity not as a ghost or a demon, but as a kind of cosmic parasite, an eel in the river of time. It thrived on paradox, on the tiny tears that occur when a moment tries to be in two places at once. "Clocks," he explained, "especially old ones steeped in human observation, were its perfect instruments. They defined time, and in their subtle imperfections, they could also bend it." The parasite latched onto these imperfections, amplified them, fed on the resulting temporal static. "It's not evil, any more than a tapeworm is evil," Irving murmured. "But it will hollow out a local timeline to sustain itself. Eventually things unravel. People get caught in loops. They remember futures that won't happen. They forget their own births." Hugh understood then. His shop wasn't a cathedral. It was a farm. And he was the farmer, tenderly cultivating the crop that was being consumed. Irving wanted to help. He had theories, drawn from forbidden texts and the whispers of other collectors. He believed the entity could be made to leave, to be lured away, if the source of paradox was concentrated and then severed. He needed the lament configuration. It was, he claimed, a focal point, A key. Terrified, Hugh agreed to a plan. Climax arrived on a night where the moon was a smudged thumbprint behind thick clouds. The air in the shop was so thick it was difficult to breathe. The ticks of the clocks had begun to sound like teeth clicking. Erica was there, monitoring her equipment, her face pale. Irving arrived, carrying an ornate box of polished ebony. The plan was simple. Use the concentrated engineered paradox of the lament configuration, placed in a resonant field created by all the other clocks, to draw the entity fully into the shop. Then, using a precisely timed electromagnetic pulse from Erica's modified equipment, they would stun the local temporal field, giving Irving a chance to seal the entity within the watch, using a ritual of sympathetic silence. It began. Hugh wound the lament configuration. Its gears, unseen, began to turn backwards with a sound like grinding bones. Irving chanted words that hurt the ear. Erica watched her screens, her finger poised over a button. The entity arrived. It was not seen, but felt as a profound, vertiginous wrongness. The shop's space warped. The far wall seemed to both recede into infinity and press close enough to touch. Hugh saw himself from behind, sitting in his leather chair, then felt himself sitting there, watching himself by the door. The sound of the clocks became a solid, vibrating mess, a physical pressure. Shadows dripped from the ceilings, pooling and forming shapes that were almost familiar. A child's face, a reaching hand, the curve of a pendulum before dissolving. The smell of ozone, of hot metal, of forgotten graves, filled the air. Irving's chant rose to a shout, but his eyes were not on the ritual. They were on the lament configuration, glittering with a sick, internal light. Hugh saw the greed in them, the triumph. This was not an exorcism. It was a harvest. Irving meant to capture the entity, to control its power for himself. "Now, Erica," Hugh cried, but his voice came out seconds later, overlapping itself. Erica slammed the button. Nothing happened. The lights did not flicker. The pulse, designed to freeze the paradox, was itself swallowed by one. The entity, drawn by the feast, focused on Irving. The collector's triumphant expression froze, then began to cycle. Joy to terror to confusion to joy again. Faster and faster. A silent film stuck on a loop. His body flickered, becoming translucent, showing the skeleton. Then the infant. Then the old man. Then the skeleton again. He was not dying. He was being unwound. His timeline played out of sequence, each moment becoming a paradox upon which the entity fed. Hugh acted not from courage, but from a clockmaker's instinct. The system was failing. The central gear was broken. He stumbled through the warping space, the floor undulating beneath him, past his younger self drinking tea, past a weeping version of Erica he hoped never to truly see. He reached the master regulator, the beautiful, sober Vienna regulator that kept all the other clocks in harmony. Its beat was the heart of the farm. With a wrenching sob, he threw open its glass door, reached in, and seized the pendulum. He stilled it. The silence was absolute. It was a sound beyond silence, a vacuum that sucked at the soul. The warping stopped. The ghostly images vanished. Irving collapsed into a heap on the floor, alive but aged decades, his eyes empty pools of forgotten time, babbling about tomorrow's yesterday. The lament configuration on the workbench gave one final sickening crunch and was still. The entity was not gone. Hugh could feel it. A vast, patient hunger hovering at the edges of things, cheated of its feast, but now aware of the farmer. It had tasted the paradox of the stilled heart, the ultimate contradiction of a timekeeper that kills time. It was satisfied. For now. In the weeks that followed, Hugh and Erica packed away the clocks. She took them, one by one, to be scattered in basements, in attics. in other collections, breaking the critical mass. The shop felt dead, just a room. But sometimes, in the deep of the night, Hugh would wake and know, with a certainty that chilled his blood, that he was not alone in the house. He would hear no tick, no talk, only a soft, dry, sliding sound, like a minute hand made of bone dragging itself across stone, searching, always searching for the next wound in the world where it could feed. He had not killed the parasite. He had simply taught it to be hungry for him. And the story does not end with Hugh Merriweather, nor with his niece, who now checks her atomic clocks with a frantic daily terror. It ends here, with you, reading these words. Listen, not with your ears, but with the part of you that feels the passage of time. That slight, lingering disorientation when you walk into a room and forget why. That déjà vu that feels a little too strong, a little too sharp. That moment when your reflection seems to blink a fraction of a second after you do. It is out there. It is all the way out there, swimming in the depths of the seconds, feeding on our little mistakes, our stutters, our regrets. It is the shape in the corner of the eye that is gone when you turn. It is the reason all clocks, in the end, run slow. It is patient. And it has learned that anything that measures time can, with the right kind of silence, be made to bleed it. So wind your watch, check your phone, listen to the rhythm of your world, and hope, dearly hope, that the hitch you feel in your own heart is just a trick of the light, and not the gentle, inexorable vibration of a pendulum that has, at last, begun to swing. The final clock to leave was the Vienna regulator. Erica had arranged for it to go to a museum in Zurich, a place of sterile glass and climate control, far from any other timepiece. As Hugh helped her lift the heavy oak case into the padded crate, his fingers lingered on the wood, smooth from generations of polish. He felt nothing. No resonance, no hum of latent time. It was just a beautiful, empty shell. Erica sealed the crate. "It's done," she said, but the words were flat, a statement of fact, not of relief. Hugh nodded, looking around the barren shop. The shelves were empty. The walls, where clocks had hung for a century, were marked by darker rectangles, like graves in reverse. Only the grandfather clock remained, a silent sentinel in the corner. They had decided it was too dangerous to move. Its pendulum was a frozen tear, its weight sealed shut. It was a monument to the first wound. He walked Erica to her car. The afternoon was bright, normal. A dog barked down the street. A lawnmower droned. The world had its rhythm back. But Hugh could no longer hear it as music. He heard it as a thin veneer, a desperate performance over a deepening silence. "Call me if you need anything," Erica said, her hand on the car door. Her eyes, so like her mother's, held a new, permanent watchfulness. "I will," he promised. He watched her drive away until her car turned the corner and vanished. The street was empty. He stood on the porch for a long time, feeling the sun on his face. His shadow lay crisp and obedient at his feet. He went inside, closed the door, and the familiar, total quiet of the empty shop enveloped him. It was over. That night, he made tea. He boiled the water on the stove, the old kettle whistling a pure single note. He poured it into his favorite chipped mug, the one that said "World's Best Clockmaker," a gift from Erica when she was 10. He added milk. He carried it to his leather chair by the cold stove and sat, facing the grandfather clock. He took a sip. The tea was hot, bitter, familiar. He set the mug on the floor beside him. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the silence press in. He listened to his own heartbeat, a slow, mortal metronome. He listened to the faint sigh of the house settling. He listened to the distant, meaningless tick of the digital alarm clock on his nightstand upstairs, a sound he had always hated for its soulless precision. And then, beneath it all, he heard the other sound. Not a tick, not a tock, a soft, dry scrape. It came from nowhere and everywhere. It was the sound of a page being turned in a book that had no pages. It was the sound of dust accumulating in a sealed room. It was patient. It was waiting. He opened his eyes. The brass pendulum of the grandfather clock hung motionless in the moonlight now streaming through the window. But on the floor, the steam from his tea was not rising in a straight column. It was coiling slowly into a perfect, lazy spiral, and his shadow, cast by the moonlight, was not lying behind the chair. It was stretched long across the floorboards, pointing directly at the clock, as if it were trying to reach the frozen pendulum. Hugh did not move. He did not scream. A strange calm settled over him, colder than the silence. He understood now. The parasite was not in the clocks. The clocks were merely the silver. The parasite was in the silence between the ticks, and he had not scattered the farm. He had simply moved the fence. The heart of the farm had always been him, the keeper of the silence, the one who had stilled the first clock. The ultimate paradox. The scraping sound grew slightly louder, not in volume, but in clarity, as if it were moving from a far corner of the universe into the room beside him. He looked at his tea. The spiral of steam was now rotating in the opposite direction. He smiled, a small, tired movement of his lips. He picked up the mug. He took another sip. The tea was already cold. He finished the tea, the cold liquid a familiar comfort in a world that had lost all its edges. The scraping faded, not gone, but receding like a tide. The steam resumed its normal, languid rise. His shadow slumped back into its proper place. The performance was over. For now. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair and watched the moonlight track its path across the floor, a slower, older clock than any he had ever owned. He thought of Irving Vale, babbling in a sanitarium about the taste of tomorrow. He thought of Erica, jumping at every glitch in her data. He thought of the 1,000 clocks, now scattered. Each one a potential tiny leak in the fabric of things. He had not solved anything. He had only made the problem quieter and more personal. In the morning, he made a decision. He went to the hardware store and bought paint, a rich, deep green. He moved the grandfather clock into the center of the room, covering the floor with drop cloths. He did not look at its still pendulum. He began to paint the walls, covering the ghostly rectangles, stroke by methodical stroke. The work was physical, mindless, and it filled the silence with a new, ordinary sound. The smell of fresh paint was astringent and clean, scouring the air of ozone and memory. He painted for 3 days. When he was done, the shop was transformed. It was no longer a clock shop. It was just a room. He bought a simple wooden desk and placed it under the window. He brought down his few books from upstairs and arranged them on a shelf. He framed a photograph of his sister, Erica's mother, and set it on the desk. On the 4th day, he went into the basement. In a corner, behind an old trunk, was a small, unmarked box. He brought it upstairs, set it on the new desk, and opened it. Inside, nestled in felt, were his watchmaker's tools. The loop, the tweezers, the tiny screwdrivers. They gleamed dully in the light. He had not touched them since the night he stopped the pendulum. He picked up the loop and fitted it to his eye. The world blurred, then snapped into a magnified, intimate clarity on the small circle of glass. He looked at the back of his own hand, at the landscape of pores and hairs and lines. He saw the pulse in his wrist, a steady, tiny throb. Time measured in blood. He put the loop down. He reached into the box and took out a broken pocket watch he had kept for decades, a cheap, mass-produced thing from a flea market. Its mainspring snapped, its hands bent. He had always meant to fix it, but never had. It was not a special clock. It held no beauty, no history. It was just broken. He cleared a space on the desk. He took a deep breath, the smell of paint and dust and his own quiet fear filling his lungs. Then, with hands that did not tremble, he began to take the watch apart. The tiny screws yielded. The case back came off. He exposed the simple, tarnished movement. He located the broken spring. The work required absolute focus, a world contained within the circle of his lamp. He did not think of parasites or of silence. He thought of tension and release, of the proper curvature of a spring, of the meshing of gears. He thought of cause and effect. As he worked, he became aware of a change in the quality of the silence in the room. It was no longer a hollow, waiting thing. It had become a medium, like clear water. And in that medium, he felt the attention. It was focused on his hands, on the tiny, deliberate creation of order from chaos. He was not measuring time. He was repairing it. He was creating a tiny, perfect sequence of cause and effect. A straight line in a world that wanted to curl in on itself. The dry, sliding sound whispered at the very edge of perception. Not a threat, but an observation. Curiosity. Hugh smiled again, a real smile this time, felt in his eyes. He had been a farmer. Then he had been prey. Now, he understood. He could be something else. A mechanic. A repairman of seconds. The parasite fed on paradox, on broken time. So he would not give it broken time. He would give it mended time. He would fix the cheap watch. And then he would find another. And another. He would fill this new green room, not with a chorus of clocks, but with the quiet, persistent evidence of repair. Each fixed timepiece would be a stone in a path, a thread pulled taut. It would not go away. He knew that now. It was part of the world, like gravity, like entropy, but it could be managed. It could be given a different kind of hunger, not a feast of chaos, but a steady, scant diet of order. He fitted the new mainspring, his movements sure and calm. The scraping sound faded completely. The room was just a room again. A man at a desk, working in a pool of light. Outside, a car passed. A bird sang. The ordinary world continued, blissfully unaware of the delicate, endless work being done within the quiet green walls. Work that held the line, ticked by patient talk, against the thing that waited in the spaces in between. Story 3. The first thing Faith felt was a pulse. Not in her wrist or her throat, but deep in the meat of her thigh. A thick, slow throb that had nothing to do with her heart. It was a second, secret rhythm, a drum beat from a darker parade. She pressed her palm against her jeans, expecting the muscle to jump, but the skin was still. The pulse was inside, a tenant with its own key. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the silence of the old Victorian she shared with Grant. It was a purchased silence, heavy and expensive, layered over the bones of the house with new insulation and double-paned windows. They had bought the quiet. Now, she was beginning to suspect they had only succeeded in making a better container for something else. Grant heard it first, though he didn't call it a pulse. He called it a buzz, a vibration in the fillings of his teeth. Late one Tuesday, when the refrigerator had cycled off, and the neighborhood dogs had ceased their barking. He lifted his head from his book, a biography of a forgotten architect. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Faith, curled in the opposite corner of the deep sofa, shook her head. She heard nothing but the hum of her own blood. But she felt it, that subterranean thump in her leg, a little stronger now, as if in answer. "It sounds like music," Grant said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Very faint, and laughter, like a party downstairs." There was no downstairs, not one that was theirs. The basement was a stone-rooted cellar, locked and forgotten. They went to the kitchen, standing on the cold tile floor, ears straining. Faith heard nothing. Grant's face was a mask of rapt concentration, his eyes glazed, a faint smile touching his lips. "It's gone now," he said, disappointed. "You have to be perfectly still to hear it." Day. It became their secret ritual, born of a dull winter and the creeping intimacy of shared solitude. They would turn everything off, the furnace, the lights, the phantom glow of standby electronics. They would sit in the absolute dark of the living room, not touching, barely breathing, and wait. For Faith, it began with the pulse, a deep internal warning bell. Then, like a radio dial finding a station from 1,000 miles away, the sounds would bleed through. It was never clear, never a coherent song or sentence. It was the ghost of a party, the shimmering haze of many voices talking at once, the brittle chime of glass, the thump of a bass line felt more than heard, a shriek of laughter that was too sharp, too prolonged, ending in a gasp. It smelled, impossibly, of ozone and spilled wine and a cloying, familiar perfume Faith could not name. The cold in the room would deepen, a damp cellar cold that clung to the skin. Grant was enchanted. He leaned into the silence, yearning for the fragments. "They sound like they're having a marvelous time," he murmured one night, his breath a white plume in the air. "I almost feel like I could step into it if I just knew the right way to listen." Faith felt only a profound, cellular wrongness. The pulse in her leg was a frantic counter-rhythm to the spectral music, a rebellion of her own flesh. She saw the way Grant's eyes lost focus, how he would reach out a hand toward the empty center of the room, his fingers curling as if around a phantom glass. She started finding him there in the dead hours, sitting alone in the dark, a sentinel waiting for a signal from a place he was beginning to prefer. Officer Crystal came on a Thursday, responding to a noise complaint from the new neighbors. She was a practical woman with a face that had seen too many variations of human folly, and she stood on their porch stamping snow from her boots. "Getting reports of a real shindig in here late nights. Music, shouting. You know how it is with old houses. Sound travels." Faith, hugging herself in the doorway, shook her head. "We're quiet. We're always quiet. We bought this house for the quiet." Crystal's eyes, the color of tarnished pennies, swept over Faith's face, noting the shadows like bruises under her eyes, the nervous tremor in her hands. She accepted a cup of tea, her gaze cataloging the room. The pristine order, the 2 indentations on the sofa facing nothing, the strange, persistent chill. Grant was effusive, charming, explaining their interest in audio phenomena, in the resonant memory of spaces. He sounded, even to Faith, like a man constructing an elaborate alibi. "You hear it too, then?" Crystal asked, her voice neutral. "Fragments," Grant said, his smile too wide. "Echoes. It's fascinating. And you, ma'am?" Crystal turned to Faith. Faith looked at the space between the armchair and the fireplace, where the cold pooled thickest. She felt the pulse in her leg, a steady dread tattoo. "I feel it," she said, and the truth of it was a stone in her throat. Crystal left with a warning that carried no weight. After her cruiser pulled away, the silence she left behind was different. It was watchful. That night, the echo came stronger. Faith could almost see shapes in the dark, the swirl of a dress, the tilt of a head. The laughter was louder, edged with a note of hysteria. The smell of perfume was overpowering, sweet as rotting gardenias. And underneath it all, a new sound. A wet, rhythmic crack, like a hammer striking a melon wrapped in wet carpet. Grant rose from the sofa. He was crying, but his face was ecstatic. "It's so clear," he whispered. "They're calling me. They want me to come to the party." "It's not a party, Grant," Faith said, her voice cracking. The pulse in her leg was a frantic drum, a war drum. It's an echo, but it's not from the past. He wasn't listening. He took a step toward the center of the room, toward the place where the cold was a solid, shimmering wall. It's a celebration. Can't you feel it? It's forever. Faith understood then. The echo was not a memory trapped in the stone. It was a lure, a bleed-through from a traumatic moment still to come. A moment of such violent, concentrated emotion that it ripped a hole in time, a wound that leaked backward. The party was the future, their future, a final terrible gathering that would never end, a scream fossilized in a loop of causality. The entity was not a ghost. It was the trauma itself, hungry and lonely, seeking to populate its eternal moment, to pull them into the photograph of its own catastrophe. She lunged for Grant, but her leg, throbbing with that alien pulse, gave way. She fell to the rug, the wool scratchy against her cheek. Grant stood at the threshold of the cold. He looked back at her, and for a second, his eyes were his own, terrified, pleading. Then the echoes swelled. The music became a deafening, joyous roar. The laughter was a razor. The wet cracking was a symphony. He smiled his charming smile and stepped through. The sound ceased. The cold vanished. The room was just a room, silent and empty. Faith lay on the floor, the pulse in her leg gone, replaced by a terrible, hollow stillness. She was alone. Officer Crystal returned the next day, her knuckles sharp on the door. Faith let her in. The house was tomb quiet. Grant was gone. There was no sign of struggle, no note. Crystal's eyes were harder now. She asked her questions, her voice a flat line in the still air. Faith answered in monosyllables. Yes, they had argued. No, she didn't know where he went. Yes, the house was very quiet. Crystal walked through the rooms, her boots heavy on the floors. In the living room, she stopped. She knelt, running her fingers over a faint, almost imperceptible depression in the rug, right where the cold had pooled. She brought her fingers to her nose and frowned. Perfume, she said. Cheap stuff, like gardenias. She stood, looking at Faith with a new, grim understanding. I've seen missing persons come and go, but a house that eats them, that's new. She left, and this time, her silence was an accusation. Faith stayed. She paid the mortgage with a numb, mechanical determination. She never turned on the music. She sat in the living room every night in the perfect silence, waiting. The echo did not return, not for her. The pulse in her leg was a memory, but sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the silence was so absolute it felt like pressure on the eardrums, she would feel a different vibration. Not a pulse, but a pull. A faint, distant tug from that spot on the rug, as if something on the other side was leaning against the veil, a hand pressed against glass from a dark room. And sometimes, if she listened with a part of her mind that was no longer entirely her own, she could hear it, not the party, but a single voice, strained and desperate, fraying at the edges of an infinite loop. Grant's voice, shouting the same words again and again, a ritual chant from a prison without walls. I'm here, let me out. I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. She would sit in the chair, her hands folded in her lap, and listen to the echo of the man she loved, a fly buzzing in the amber of a moment that had not yet happened, but always would. And she would whisper back into the waiting quiet, a prayer to a god of broken time, a joining of the ritual. I hear you. I hear you. I hear you are not alone. I hear you. I hear you. I hear you. You are not alone, I hear you, I hear you, I hear you. And in the future, in the past, in the eternal now of the party that never ends, the echo listens and waits and grows. Well, the whisper became part of the house's new silence. A thread she spun each night to keep him tethered, or perhaps to tether herself. She stopped going to town. The groceries arrived in silent, automated deliveries she scheduled online. She watched from the window as the delivery person, always a different one, would hurry back to their car, casting uneasy glances at the Victorians' blank windows. The house had a reputation now, a flavor. It tasted of absence. Then, one Tuesday, the pull changed. It was no longer a gentle tug, but a sudden, sharp yank from the center of the living room. So visceral, it pulled a gasp from her lungs. The air didn't turn cold. It turned thin, rarefied, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. And the voice, Grant's voice, changed its chant. Faith. Faith. The door. The door is here. Faith. The door. Nice. Her own ritual whisper died in her throat. She stood, her body moving without her consent, drawn toward the depression in the rug. The perfume bloomed in the air, not the cloying gardenia, but the ozone and spilled wine, and underneath it, the iron tang of blood. The shapes returned, but they were no longer swirling. They were frozen, a tableau of figures caught mid-motion, their faces blurred smears of light. And in the center, a darker shape, a rip in the fabric of the room. It was not a doorway of light, but of a deeper dark, a black so absolute it seemed to suck the color from the walls around it. Grant's voice came from it, clear and close, and utterly sane. It's a way through, Faith. It's not the party. It's behind the party. I found the back door. Take my hand. A hand emerged from the darkness. It was Grant's hand, down to the scar on his knuckle from a long-ago bicycle accident. It was solid, real, trembling with effort. Every cell in her body screamed to run. The pulse in her leg reignited, a violent warning throb that traveled up her spine. This was the lure perfected. This was the trauma offering a solution, a way to end the loneliness of its eternal loop. It would give her back her husband to get her too. But his voice, it held none of the party's ecstatic hysteria. It held only him, the man she loved, tired and scared and trying to come home. I can't hold it open long, he pleaded, his fingers stretching toward her. Officer Crystal's words echoed in her mind. A house that eats them. But what if it also sometimes spat them back out? What if the echo could be negotiated with? She thought of the years ahead, of the whispering in the dark, of the slow erosion of her own self into a keeper of a haunted silence. She thought of Grant, trapped in a single screaming moment, finding a crack and clawing his way toward it. Faith did not take his hand. Instead, she knelt, just at the edge of the darkness, and pressed her own palm flat against the floor, on her side of the veil. "Push," she said, her voice steady. "Push the door here, to me, all the way." A silence from the dark, then a groan, a sound of unimaginable strain. The black doorway shuddered. The frozen, blurry figures in the room behind him began to twitch, their heads turning in slow, jerky motions toward the destruction. The joyful music warped, sliding into a minor key of panic. The hand retreated. For a terrible moment, Faith thought she had lost him. Then the darkness pulsed. It bulged toward her, like a membrane stretching. She saw his shape now, his whole body pressed against the inside of the veil, his mouth open in a silent scream of effort. The cold returned, but it was a new cold. The cold of a door opening between worlds, sucking the heat from hers to fuel its own impossible geometry. With a sound like tearing silk and breaking bone, The dark spot on the rug split. Not a door, a hole, and from it poured the party. It was not an echo. It was the thing itself. The deafening music was a physical wave that knocked pictures from the walls. The laughter was a swarm of stinging insects. The smell of perfume and blood was a solid fog. And the people, they were no longer ghosts. They were almost solid, their clothes dripping with spectral champagne, their eyes wide with a fixed, frantic gaiety. They swirled into her living room, their dancing feet leaving no prints, their voices a cacophony of overlapping conversations about nothing. And among them, stumbling forward, was Grant. He was solid too. He fell onto her rug, gasping, his clothes damp with that otherworldly cold. Behind him, the hole did not close. It remained, a jagged window into a raging, endless night. The party was in both places now, bleeding into her world. Grant looked up at her, his eyes clear. He had escaped, but he had not closed the door. He had broken it. The first of the revelers, a woman in a shimmering dress that was torn at the shoulder, turned her glowing eyes toward Faith. She smiled, a smile too wide for her face, and extended a hand that shimmered like a mirage. "Come now," the woman said, her voice the chime of breaking glass. "The celebration is just beginning. And now, it's so much bigger." Faith backed away, her heel catching on the edge of the hearth. The woman's hand remained extended, insistent. The other figures were solidifying, their forms gaining density from the warmth of the room, the stolen silence. A man in a tuxedo with a dark stain spreading across his chest laughed, a sound like dry sticks breaking, and lifted a spectral bottle toward the ceiling. Grant scrambled to his feet, grabbing Faith's arm. His touch was feverishly cold, leaching the heat from her skin. "I'm sorry," he choked out. I thought it was a way out. It was a trapdoor. I just made it bigger." The hole in the rug was not a void anymore. It was a wound, and through it Faith could see the same room, their living room, but twisted. The walls were slick and dark. The furniture melted into strange organic shapes. The party was there too, a reflection in a corrupted mirror, and the revelers moved seamlessly between the two spaces, as if the breach was merely a change in scenery. The trauma was not an echo. It was a living organism, and it had just discovered a new host. The woman took a step forward. Her feet made a soft, wet sound on the floorboards. "You've been such a quiet audience," she sing-songed. "But a party needs participants." The pull was gone. In its place was a relentless, pressing invitation. The air thickened with the need to join, to laugh, to shatter glass and scream with the rest. Faith felt a hysterical giggle rise in her own throat, a foreign impulse borrowed from the atmosphere. Grant's fingers tightened on her arm, not in reassurance, but in a spasm of shared dread. He was hearing the call again. She could see it in the flicker of longing beneath his terror. She tore her gaze from the woman and looked at the hole. The logic of it, the terrible logic of a wound in time, clicked into place. It was not a door to be closed. It was a rupture to be sealed. And it was feeding on their attention, on their fear, on their very reality. "Don't look at them," Faith said, her voice a ragged whisper. "Don't listen. It's the attention that makes it real here." She forced her eyes shut. The music swelled, offended. Cold, intangible hand brushed her cheek. She slapped it away, her palm meeting something that felt like static and rotten silk. "Grant, look at me," she commanded, eyes still squeezed shut. "Only at me. Remember the quiet we bought." She heard his ragged breath. "It's so loud, Faith. It's not here. It's a memory, a future memory. It doesn't get to have our now." She was parroting her own desperate theory, willing it into truth. She focused on the memory of true silence, the expensive, empty silence they had installed. She thought of double-paned windows, layers of insulation, a sealed vault. She imagined that silence not as an absence, but as a substance, a thick gel poured into every corner, smothering the sound. A strange thing happened. The music didn't fade, but it became muffled, as if heard from several rooms away. She cracked an eye open. The shimmering woman was still there, but her form flickered, like a bad transmission. She looked confused. The hole in the rug pulsed, a weak, lazy beat. "It's working," Faith breathed. "It needs our belief, our participation. Starve it." Grant, his face a mask of concentration, nodded. He looked only at Faith's face, his eyes locked on hers. He began to whisper, not the ritual of before, but something mundane, domestic. "We need to repaint the trim. The white is too stark. Maybe a cream? A warmer cream." He was rebuilding the world, board by board. Faith joined him, her voice trembling but clear. "The faucet in the guest bath drips. We should fix that. And the rose bush by the porch is getting wild." They built a litany of the ordinary. Dripping faucets, untrimmed roses, paint swatches, grocery lists. They built a wall of the boring, the practical, the utterly, defiantly real. The party recoiled. The figures blurred, their laughter fraying into nonsense syllables. The whole began to knit itself at the edges, the darkness receding like a tide, pulling the spectral shapes back with it. The woman in the torn dress gave them one last furious look, a look of profound loneliness, before she dissolved into a swirl of ozone and gardenia. With a final, soft sigh, the rug was just a rug again. The depression remained, a permanent scar. The room was freezing, and every surface was beaded with a fine, cold sweat. But it was silent. Their own, hard-won, fragile silence. Grant sank to his knees, sobbing with relief. Faith stood over him, shaking, the pulse in her leg a distant memory. They had not closed the wound. They had asserted a boundary. The house still held the breach, but it was contained, for now, by the sheer, stubborn weight of the mundane. She knew Officer Crystal would return. There would be questions about the broken pictures, the strange dampness, the haunted look in their eyes. They would have to answer. They would have to learn to live with a secret that was no longer just a whisper in the dark, but a scar in the floor of their home. A scar that, on certain quiet nights, might still feel warm to the touch, and might, if they ever forgot to pay attention, begin to itch. Story 4. The curtain in the living room moved, not with the lilt of a breeze, for the windows were sealed tight against the world, but with a slow, deliberate shift, as if a hand had brushed its hem, and then thought better of it. Ashley watched it from the hallway, her breath a shallow tide in her chest. The fabric settled. The silence that followed was not empty, but thick, a substance she had to push through to enter the room. This was her life now, a life of sealed windows and air purifiers, humming a constant, low monastic chant. A life without scent. It had begun a year ago, not with a bang, but with a whisper of jasmine from a passing woman on the street. A wave of nausea so profound it had buckled Ashley's knees. Then came the migraines, starbursts of pain behind her eyes, at the smell of coffee brewing, of Dashiell's shaving cream, of the damp earth of her own potted fern. The diagnosis was rapid-onset idiopathic osmophobia, a fancy cage for a terrifying animal. The treatment was avoidance. She became a curator of the odorless. Unscented soap, scentless detergent, food boiled to bland submission. Her world shrank to the sterile geometry of their home, a gallery where the art had been removed, leaving only blank walls and the echo of what once was. Dashiell tried. He was a man built for fragrance, a gardener of sensations. He used to bring her lilacs from the market, their purple heads heavy with nostalgia. Now he smelled of nothing, having scrubbed himself raw with the clinical soap she could tolerate. His love, once expressed in cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings and sandalwood candles at night, now fumbled in the dark, a mute language of concerned glances and hesitant touches. "It's psychological, Ash," he'd say, his voice soft in the antiseptic air. "Dr. Varma says we can retrain your brain. A single drop of lavender oil on a cotton ball from across the room. Just to look at it." His eyes held the desperate hope of a man watching his wife dissolve in clear water. Dr. Cheryl Varma was not so sure. She was a neurologist with the patience of a stone and eyes that missed nothing. She listened to Ashley's descriptions, not just of pain, but of a feeling of attenuation. A sense that the smell was not just offensive, but extractive. "It feels like it's pulling something out of me," Ashley whispered in the sterile office, the words sounding mad even to her. "Like when a child sucks the juice from a popsicle and leaves behind the hollow, chalky stick." Cheryl did not dismiss this. She ordered more scans. EEGs that mapped the storm clouds in Ashley's brain when presented with vanillin or citrus. The results were anomalous. The fear centers lit up, yes, a brilliant fireworks display of terror. But so did the regions associated with self-recognition, with identity. It was as if the smell was not just an assault, but a theft. One evening, in the deep blue hour before full dark, Ashley saw them. She was sitting in the living room. The purifiers hummed the only sound. A shaft of dying light cut through the room, full of lazy, swirling dust motes. And then she saw that some of the motes were not dust. They were slower, more fluid, and they moved against the air currents. They clustered, a faint shimmer in the air above Dashiell's discarded sweater, the one he'd worn to the office that day. They were delicate, translucent, like the ghosts of jellyfish, or the pulsing veins in a closed eyelid. As she watched, frozen, the shimmer seemed to pulse, and a faint, forgotten ghost of Dashiell's cologne, a scent she had banned months ago, teased the air, only to be instantly, vacuously, gone. The shimmer condensed, satisfied, and drifted towards the sealed window, passing through the glass as if it were smoke. She told Cheryl, not Dashiell. Dashiell would see a breakdown, a shattering of the last fragile pain. Cheryl saw data. She arrived with equipment not found in standard clinics: spectrometers, air particulate analyzers, modified slides. She turned Ashley's home into a laboratory. She confirmed it. The creatures, for they were creatures, Cheryl insisted, a previously undetected form of life existing in the olfactory spectrum, were drawn to the complex chemical signatures of human emotion and memory. A perfume was not just a smell. It was a story, a memory of a first date, a declaration of self, a shield, or an invitation. The creatures fed on that narrative residue. They didn't just consume the scent molecule. They unspooled the identity tied to it. "Your phobia isn't an illness, Ashley," Cheryl said, her voice low with awe and horror. "It's an evolutionary adaptation, a canary in a coal mine. You don't smell the rose. You smell the thing feeding on the idea of the rose inside you. Your terror is your body's last-ditch effort to preserve what you are." The revelation was a different kind of prison. Knowledge did not bring power, only a more precise map of the walls. Ashley watched Dashiell move through the world, shedding invisible clouds of self with every step, every spritz of deodorant, every cup of fragrant tea. He was a banquet, walking unaware through a room of ghosts. Her love for him curdled into a frantic, silent guardianship. She begged him to stop, to become like her, odorless and safe. He saw only her madness deepening. The climax was born of love, as such things often are. "Dashiell, driven by a husband's futile need to fix, to heal, planned an intervention. He filled the house with her former life. Her favorite gardenia perfume, fresh basil. The pages of an old, mildewed book she loved. He did it while she slept, a fragrant ambush meant to shock her system back to normalcy. Ashley woke into a world of poison. The air was a solid, assaulting mass of scent. But beneath the immediate, scalding pain was a sound. A low, collective hum, like 1,000 wet fingers on crystal rims. The air thickened. In the lamplight, the creatures were no longer faint shimmers. They were visible, a swarm of intricate vibrating filaments, drawn to the violent outburst of her stolen identity hanging in the air. They coalesced above the bottle of gardenia, a pulsing, hungry nebula, and she saw what they did. As they fed, the scent didn't just fade. The memory attached to it, her mother wearing that scent, a comforting hand on a childhood-fevered brow, didn't just retreat. It was erased. A blank spot opened in her mind, cold and smooth as a river stone. Dashiell stood in the doorway, his face a mask of hopeful concern. "Ash, I'm here. It's okay." His words were a beacon. The gardenia swarm quivered. Then, as one entity, it streamed towards him, towards the rich, untapped symphony of his identity. His pine soap, his coffee breath, his hopeful sweat. Ashley did not think. She moved. She threw herself at him, a collision of fear and love, wrapping her arms around him, pressing her odorless body against his fragrant one, trying to shield him with her nullity. The swarm enveloped them both. She felt it then, not as smell, but as a sensation of freezing evaporation, a psychic siphon. She heard Dashiell gasp, not in pain, but in confusion, a profound and deepening loss. He was forgetting why he was here, forgetting his worry, forgetting her. A scream built in her, not of terror, but of pure, defiant negation. It was a sound that held no memory, no story, no scent. It was the sound of a void. She opened her mouth and let it out. The swarm recoiled. The humming pitch changed to a dissonant shiver. The intricate filaments seemed to fray, to unknit. They could not feed on her. She was anathema. They dissipated, not with a pop, but with a sigh of static, fleeing from the absolute zero of her being. Silence. The house was still. The bottles of scent sat inert, now just chemical liquids. Their stories and the fed on them gone. Dashiell blinked, slowly. He looked at her, his eyes clearing, but empty of the frantic love that had driven him. He looked neutral. "Ashley," he said, his voice flat. What's going on? I feel strange." "Men." She held him, her arms around a man who was now, in some fundamental way, a stranger. She had saved him from being consumed. In doing so, she had scraped away the layers of scent that were the texture of his soul. He was blank. She was the curator of a hollow gallery. In the weeks that followed, a quietness descended. Dashiell went back to work. He used his sandalwood soap. He drank his coffee. But he did these things by rote, his emotional resonance muted. It was pleasant, agreeable, a sketch of a man. Ashley maintained her odorless existence, not out of fear now, but out of a grim understanding. She was the guardian at the gate, the silent sentinel against the invisible feast. One afternoon, she sat in the living room. The air purifier was off. The windows were open. A real breeze, carrying the scent of cut grass and distant rain, drifted in. She felt nothing. No nausea, no terror, no pull. The creatures did not come. They had learned. She was not food. She was the end of the world. She watched the curtain. It moved in the breeze, a gentle, natural sway. Everything was perfectly still. The house was safe. The horror was over. It had left nothing behind but the two of them, and the immense deafening quiet of what had been lost. As if nothing had ever happened. The cut grass smell should have been a symphony. It had been her favorite, the smell of childhood summers, and the promise of long, free evenings. Now it was just data. A chemical compound. Neutral. She watched Dashiell in the garden, mechanically trimming the edges. He did it because it was Saturday, and that was the task for Saturday. Not because he took pride in the sharp lines, not because he used to grin at her through the window, pretending to duel with the head shears. Came in, wiping his hands on his trousers. A faint, clean scent of sweat and soil followed him. It was just a smell. It carried no history of hard work, no warmth of his body, no intimacy. It was a weather report. "Lunch?" he asked. His voice was pleasant. It was the most terrible sound she knew. "I'm not hungry," she said. He nodded, not pushing, not concerned, just accepting the data. "I'll make a sandwich." She followed him into the kitchen, not because she wanted to, but because she was a ghost in her own house, and ghosts drift. He took out the unscented turkey, the plain bread. His movements were efficient, empty. He used to make sandwiches with a flourish, layering on pickles and spicy mustard she could smell from the living room, then presenting them with a joke. Now, he assembled nutrients. A thought, cold and sharp, pierced her. Was this it? Was her victory simply a slower, more complete annihilation? To live in a world stripped of meaning was not to live at all. It was to be one of them, one of the creatures, existing only to consume, or in her case, to not consume. A void. Cheryl called it a stable equilibrium. The creatures avoided her. Dashiell was safe in her presence, as his emitted sense, devoid of strong emotional resonance, seemed less attractive to them. The world had reached a balance. A sterile, silent balance. "I'm going for a walk," Ashley said abruptly. Dashiell looked up, a flicker of something, not worry, but mob processing, in his eyes. "Okay, do you want company?" The old Dashiell would have insisted. He would have seen the walk as a breakthrough, a chance to gently reintroduce the world. This Dashiell was just being polite. "No," she said. "Thank you." She left the house, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that echoed in her bones. The neighborhood air was a cacophony of nothing. Laundry detergent, car exhaust, blooming flowers. It was all just noise. She walked, her hands in her pockets, a null zone moving through the world. She found herself at the small park at the end of their street. A young mother pushed a toddler on a swing. The child squealed with laughter. A pure, scentless sound. The mother smiled, a private, weary, happy smile. And Ashley caught a whisper of her perfume. Something vanilla and soft. A memory, sharp as a knife, cut through Ashley's numbness. It was the ghost of a feeling, not the memory itself. The feeling of being that safe, of being the source of that joy. And she saw it. A faint, shimmering distortion in the air near the woman's neck, drawn to the vanilla, to the story of comfort and motherhood it represented. It was a small one, a solitary feeder. It pulsed gently, feeding. A revulsion, deeper than the old nausea, rose in Ashley. It wasn't fear for herself. It was a furious, protective rage. That story was not for taking. That joy was not food. Without thinking, she walked toward the bench. The creature, sensing her nullity, flinched and skittered away, dissipating into the sunlight. The woman looked up, sensing nothing but a passerby. She gave Ashley a polite, distant smile. Ashley sat on a bench far away, her heart hammering. The reaction had been instinctual. Not defense, but offense. She had driven it away. She sat there as the afternoon faded, watching people and their invisible halos of self. She saw an old man feeding pigeons, the scent of his wool coat and peppermint candies attracting a faint, lazy shimmer. She walked past him, and it fled. She saw two teenagers sharing headphones, their cloud of shampoo and bubblegum and adolescent longing shimmering with several of the delicate, hungry things. A steady, purposeful look from Ashley scattered them. They feared her. Her nothingness was a weapon. She returned home as dusk painted the sky. Dashiell was reading a book, his face placid in the lamplight. He looked up. "Did you have a nice walk?" She looked at him. This man she had saved, and in saving, had broken. She thought of the young mother's smile, the old man's quiet contentment. They were all living banquets, unaware, and she was the only one who could see the feast. "It was informative," she said, her voice sounding strange in her own ears. A plan, cold and clear, was forming in the void where her old self had lived. It was not a plan of healing. There was no healing from this. It was a plan of war. She would not be the curator of a hollow gallery. She would be its warden. She would walk the world, this odorless ghost, and she would scour it clean. She would stand between the stories and the things that fed on them. She would be the silence that allowed the song to continue, unheard by her, but played nonetheless. She went to the window and closed it, locking out the night. She turned and looked at Dashiell. He had already returned to his book. "I'm going to need Cheryl's help," Ashley said, more to herself than to him. He nodded absently. Not really hearing, and that was fine. He didn't need to understand. He just needed to be safe. They all did. And she, the hollow woman, the end of their world, was the only one who could make them so. The horror was not over. It had simply found its soldier. The next morning she called Cheryl. The neurologist listened, not to the words about walks in the park, but to the steel underneath them. "You're talking about active engagement," Cheryl said, her voice careful. "This isn't passive avoidance anymore. You're proposing to become a predator of predators." "Is that what I am?" Ashley asked, watching Dashiell butter his toast with methodical precision. "I have no idea what you are," Cheryl replied, a hint of scientific thrill in her tone. "But the data suggests you exert a repulsive field on them. A null zone. We can measure that. Using you as a mobile deterrent. It's theoretically sound. Ethically, it's a gray area. You'd be altering an ecosystem we don't understand. I'm not interested in ethics. I'm interested in containment." Ashley heard the coldness in her own voice and did not regret it. Cheryl agreed to come over, to bring new equipment. She wanted to map the radius of Ashley's effect, to see if it could be focused or intensified. Ashley became a test subject again, but this time she was in charge. She stood in the center of the living room, while Cheryl released controlled puffs of scent, a drop of rose oil on a hot plate, from varying distances. They used the spectrometers to watch the creatures gather, then watch them scramble and dissolve as Ashley stepped closer. Her null field had a radius of about 8 feet, a personal bubble of protection. "It's not just that you don't produce a scent for them to consume," Cheryl murmured, studying the readings. "It's that you actively cancel the narrative resonance around you. You turn stories back into mere chemicals. You are a walking eraser." Ashley thought of Dashiell's blankness. She had erased him too. The weapon was indiscriminate. Over the next week, she began her patrols. She went to the grocery store, not to shop, but to walk the aisles. In the detergent aisle, thick with the cloying ghosts of spring meadows and mountain air, she saw clusters of the creatures thick as gnats. She walked slowly down the row, and in her wake, the shimmering faded. The smells remained, but they became flat, unconsumed. She was an icebreaker, cutting a path through an invisible sea. She visited a coffee shop, the air rich with roasted history and anxious ambition. She stood in line, and the lively shimmer near a man arguing on his phone stuttered and died. He paused, mid-sentence, looking suddenly confused, less angry. He finished his call quietly, rubbing his temple. Her effect was a blunt instrument. She protected, but she also diminished. She could not separate the theft from the texture. She was learning that the two were perhaps the same thing. One evening, returning from the library where she had silently cleansed the air of old paper and concentrated thought, she found Dashiell not in his usual chair. He was in the spare room, standing before an open box. It was a box of his old things, from before her illness. Photographs, ticket stubs, a dried corsage. He held a faded baseball cap in his hands. He looked up as she entered. His eyes were different. Not filled, but searching. "Ashley," he said, "I found this. I know this hat. I can feel that I know it, but I can't remember why." She stood in the doorway, her null field stretching into the room. She saw no creatures here, only dust and memory. She also saw the faint, trembling beginning of a scent rising from the old wool. Sweat, sunshine, the ghost of cheap beer. A story was trying to surface. She could step closer. She could shut it down, keep him safe and blank. Or she could step back. Her heart was a drum of war in a silent body. She took a single step backward, over the threshold, minimizing her influence. Dashiell brought the hat to his face. He inhaled deeply. He closed his eyes. A long moment passed. Then, a slow, real smile touched his lips. Not the polite one, an old one. "Wrigleyfield," he whispered, his voice thick. "My dad. It was so hot. The Cubs lost." He opened his eyes. They were wet. "He bought me this hat even though they lost. He said we'd remember the day, not the score." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second she saw him, the him she had loved, swimming up from the depths. The connection was terrifying. It was a scent in the air, a story, vulnerable and exposed. And she saw, at the periphery of her vision, a faint, hungry shimmer begin to gather at the window, drawn by the sudden, potent emission of a reclaimed self. Ashley didn't move. She held Dashiell's gaze, letting the moment hang, precious and fragile. Then, with a force of will that felt like tearing her own skin, she stepped forward into the room, into the center of his memory. Her field enveloped him. The shimmer at the window recoiled and vanished. The light in Dashiell's eyes didn't go out. Not completely, but it dimmed. The vividness of the memory receded, packed away again, safe from the feeders. The smile remained, but it was softer, puzzled. "That was strange," he said, placing the hat back in the box. "It was," Ashley said, her voice gentle. "It's okay." She understood now the true cost of her duty. She was not just a warden. She was a gardener of silence. She would have to decide, moment by moment, which stories were allowed to breathe. And for how long, before she had to snuff them out to save them. She could permit a whisper, but never a shout. She would let Dashiell have his fragments under her watchful, nullifying eye. The war was not in the park or the supermarket. It was here, in this quiet room, in the space between a memory and the thing that wanted to eat it. She walked to the window and closed the blinds. She would let him have a little more of the hat story tomorrow. Just a little. It was all she could afford to give. Story 5. The curtain in the kitchen window of the old Airstream trailer was not right. It was a small thing, a faded gingham thing, and it hung limp in the thick, humid Indiana afternoon. Then it moved. Not with a breeze, for the air was dead and tasted of hot asphalt and distant rain. It moved as if something behind it, in the dark space between the window and the fabric, had exhaled. A slow, deliberate billow, a sigh of dust motes caught in a sudden, impossible current. Then it fell still. It was the first thing Karina noticed, though she could not say why it snagged her attention so completely. A fishhook in the corner of her vision. She and Jace were lost. The map on Jace's phone had dissolved into a spinning gray circle 20 minutes ago, somewhere past the last credible farmhouse, and the two-lane road had begun to feel less like a path and more like a conveyor belt, drawing them deeper into a landscape of corn that stretched to a bleached, merciless sky. The corn was too tall, too uniform, a green wall that whispered of dry stalks rubbing together, a sound like 1,000 brittle tongues. "There," Jace said, his voice cracking from the silence. He pointed. A sign, rust-eaten and leaning, announced simply, "Eat." Below it, a smaller, hand-painted arrow pointed down a gravel drive nearly swallowed by weeds. "This feels like the preamble to my murder," Karina said. But she was tired, and the dust from the road coated her throat. Jace just turned, the tires crunching protest. At the end of the drive, nestled in a clearing that felt too sudden, too perfectly circular, stood the diner. It was a relic, a long, low-slung box of chrome and fogged glass, its name. The Echo, still legible in peeling cursive on the roof. The windows were dark, not with cleanliness, but with a deep, smoky opacity. A single neon sign in the window, unlit, spelled out coffee. It did not look open. It did not look like it had been open in decades. Yet the gravel around it was strangely swept, and the air held no scent of decay, only a faint, sweet odor like old paper and vanilla. The door opened without a sound. Inside, the light was amber, filtered through decades of grease and nicotine stained onto the windows. It was preternaturally cool. The air conditioning hummed a single low note that vibrated in the fillings of their teeth. Booths of cracked red vinyl lined the walls, and a long counter with stools bolted to the floor stretched the length of the room. It was empty, spotless. The chrome gleamed with a hard, cold light. It was a museum diorama of a forgotten America. A woman stood behind the counter. She had not been there a moment before. Karina was sure of it. She was tall and lean, dressed in a white uniform dress that was too crisp, too bright against the gloom. Her name tag read Kara. Her hair was the color of cold ash, pulled back in a severe knot, and her face was a study in pleasant neutrality. But her eyes were wrong. They were the color of the sky just before a storm breaks, a luminous, unsettling gray, and they held no reflection of the room or the people in it. "Sit anywhere," Kara said. Her voice was smooth, a radio announcer's voice from a bygone era. It did not echo in the quiet space, but was absorbed by it. They slid into a booth. There were no menus. Kara approached, her white shoes silent on the linoleum. "We only serve the coffee," she said, and her smile was a small, precise movement. "It's particular. Just coffee?" Jace asked, his attempt at lightness falling flat. "It is enough," Kara replied. Her gaze lingered on him a moment too long. "It will taste like something you have forgotten, something sweet." She brought two thick, white mugs. The liquid inside was black, oil-slick, steaming gently. It smelled not of coffee, but of something profoundly, intimately familiar. To Karina, it was the smell of the pine sol her grandmother used to mop the kitchen on Sunday afternoons, mixed with the sugar of birthday cake. To Jace, his breath caught. His eyes lost their focus. "It smells like the paste we used in kindergarten. The safe kind. And the way the sun hit the rug in my old treehouse." "Drink," Kara said, not a suggestion, but a gentle command. Jace lifted the mug and drank. His entire body went slack. A tear traced a clean path through the road dust on his cheek. It tastes like the first day of summer vacation, 1998. I can feel the sprinkler water on my legs. I can hear my mom calling me in for lunch. Grilled cheese with the crusts cut off. He took another, deeper drink. A desperate, thirsty pull. It's perfect. Karina watched him, a cold knot forming in her stomach. The smell from her own cup was overpoweringly nostalgic, a siren song of comfort. But she saw the way JC's eyes had filmed over, how he was no longer looking at the diner, but through it, at some private interior sun. She lifted her mug to her lips, but did not drink. She pretended. Good, isn't it? Kara whispered. She was suddenly beside the table, having moved without sound. She was looking at Jace with a tenderness that was voracious. He has a strong memory, vivid, uncorrupted. What is this? Karina asked, her own voice a dry rustle. A service, Kara said, turning her storm-cloud eyes on Karina. The world is a loud, sharp, disappointing place. We offer a quiet harbor, a perfect echo. She gestured with a chin towards the back of the diner, past the counter, where a dark hallway led to a door marked private. Some choose to stay in the harbor, like Douglas Ray. As if on cue, a man emerged from the hallway. He was perhaps 60, dressed in clean, simple clothes. His face was placid, blank as a pond on a windless day. He walked to the far end of the counter and sat on a stool, his hands folded before him. He did not look at them. He did not seem to see anything at all. Douglas Ray found his echo 7 years ago, Kara murmured. The taste of his mother's peppermint tea, the sound of his father tuning an old radio to a baseball game. A Tuesday in October 1967. He said it was the last day he felt truly safe. He's still there. He'll always be there. We keep the body comfortable. Horror, cold and crystalline, dripped down Karina's spine. She looked at Jace. He had finished his coffee. He was staring at his empty mug as if it were a holy relic. His expression was one of rapturous, heartbreaking loss. I want another, he said, his voice thick. I need another. Jace. No, Karina said, grabbing his wrist. His skin was cool. Didn't you hear her? Look at that man. Jace shook her off, his movement languid, dreamlike. He's happy, can't you see? He's safe. I just want to taste it again. The grilled cheese, the sun. He looked at Kara, his eyes pleading. Please. Kara's perfect smile returned. She took his mug. Of course. Karina stood up. We're leaving. Now. Jace did not move. You go. I'm going to have one more. The argument that followed was a whisper in a tomb. Karina's pleas were met with a placid, immovable wall. Jace was already half gone, lured by the echo. Kara moved behind the counter, preparing the second cup, her movements ritualistic. Karina, desperate. Her heart, a frantic bird in her chest, did the only thing she could think to do. She walked quickly down the dark hallway towards the private door. She had to see. She had to know what keeping the body comfortable meant. The door was unlocked. The room beyond was not an office, but a small, clean, clinical space. It looked like a cross between a doctor's exam room and a monastic cell. A single, comfortable-looking chair sat in the center. Tubes and wires ran from a small, silent machine beside it, ending in soft pads. And on the walls were not pictures, but shelves. Dozens of shelves. And on each shelf sat a simple white mug. Each mug was different. Chipped here, stained there. One had a cartoon dinosaur. Another, a faded logo for a tractor company. They were ordinary mugs, save for one detail. From each, a faint, barely perceptible hum seemed to emanate, a vibration felt in the teeth more than heard. And each hum was different. One was a joyful, sunny buzz. Another, a somber, peaceful thrum. A third vibrated with the frantic, giggling energy of a childhood birthday party. They were not empty. Karina leaned closer. Inside each mug at the bottom was a residue. Not coffee grounds. It was a fine, iridescent powder that seemed to hold the light and the hum within it. It was memory, distilled, bottled, and shelved. One mug, newer than the others, sat slightly apart. It was plain. The hum from it was of fresh-cut grass and static from a television set. A small typed label on the shelf below read, DouglasRay.R. Tapping the mug, Karina understood then with a clarity that froze the blood in her veins. The coffee was not a drug. It was a transaction. The first taste was a sample, a lure. The second taste began the withdrawal. The memory was not just recalled. It was extracted, siphoned off, perfected, and stored here in this quiet room. The person was left an empty vessel, their body tended to by Kara, their consciousness forever trapped in the loop of that single, flawless, stolen moment. The diner was not a restaurant. It was a gallery, a library, a farm. She heard a soft sigh behind her. Kara stood in the doorway, not blocking it, but filling it. Her storm-gray eyes were no longer neutral. They held a deep, cosmic hunger, a patience that spanned epochs. "You shouldn't be in here," she said, and in her voice was the sound of pages turning in a forgotten book. "The echoes are delicate. They need quiet. What are you?" Karina breathed. "A curator," Kara said, stepping into the room. She did not walk so much as flow, a shift of light and shadow. "A collector. Sentiment is the strongest energy in your fragile universe. Pure, potent, uncorrupted by the present. It sustains. This place is a siphon, a gentle one. We take only what is offered, what is willingly given for one more taste of paradise." Outside, Karina heard the clink of a mug on Formica. "JC's second cup. The point of no return." "Stop it," Karina said, backing away, her hand closing around the plain white mug labeled for Douglas Ray. "Don't you touch him." Kara's head tilted. "Or what? You will break an echo? You would shatter a man's heaven? That is the true horror, isn't it? Not my collection. The fact that you would condemn him to the waking world, to the pain, the noise, the inevitable end, just to have his company. That is selfish." The logic was a serpent coiling around Karina's resolve. She looked at the mug in her hand, humming with another man's perfect October. She looked at the shelves, a chorus of stolen joy. She thought of Jace, his face already losing its edges, smoothing into the placid blankness of Douglas Ray. She did not throw the mug. She placed it back, carefully, on its shelf. Then she ran. Past Kara, who did not stop her, who only watched with those hungry, reflective eyes. Down the hallway, into the diner. Jace was slumped in the booth, a beatific smile on his face. His mug was empty. "Jace, please," she sobbed, pulling at his arm. He was heavy, boneless. "Fight it. Come back." He looked at her, and for a second, a flicker of the old Jace was there. Terrified, drowning in honey. "It's so warm here, Karina," he slurred. "The sun, it never sets." And then it was gone. His eyes cleared into a serene, empty blue. He looked at her as one might look at a mildly interesting insect. He gently removed her hand from his arm. "You should have had the coffee," he said, his voice flat, pleasant. It's very good." Kara was beside them again. He's ready for his chair. The initial extraction is always the most vivid. We'll preserve it beautifully. She helped Jace to his feet. He went willingly, like a sleepwalker. No, Karina screamed, the sound swallowed by the humming quiet of the diner. Kara paused, guiding Jace toward the hallway. She looked back over her shoulder. You can stay, if you like. The booth is comfortable. In time, the memory of this moment, this sharp, painful, real moment, will itself become a kind of nostalgia. Bitter, but potent. Then they were gone, into the dark of the hallway. The door clicked shut. Karina stood alone in the amber silence. The hum of the neon sign outside flickered once, then glowed to life, casting a bloody coffee onto the empty counter. She was trapped. Her keys were in Jace's pocket. The road was miles away, through the whispering wall of corn. She walked to the booth and sat. The cool vinyl sighed beneath her. She stared at Jace's empty mug. A single iridescent drop clung to the inside rim, catching the neon light. It held a tiny, perfect sunbeam from a 1998 summer. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. The light in the diner did not change. The hum never varied. Eventually, the private door opened. Kara emerged alone. She walked behind the counter, picked up a clean white mug, a new one, plain and expectant, and placed it on a shelf below the coffee machine. She took a small typed label from her pocket and smoothed it onto the shelf below. It read, in neat block letters, Jace, first summer. She then turned and walked towards Karina's booth. In her hands was a fresh mug. The steam rose, carrying a scent that unraveled Karina's clenched heart. It was the smell of her father's workshop, of sawdust and oiled metal, of the safety of being small and watched over. It was the most beautiful smell in the world. Kara set the mug down on the formica with a soft, final tap. She did not speak. She only smiled her small, precise smile and retreated behind the counter, where she stood, waiting, watching, a curator before a potential new exhibit. Karina looked at the mug. The warmth from it reached her cold fingers. The memory it promised was an ache so deep, it felt like a physical hollow in her chest. The diner was silent. The corn outside whispered its dry, endless secret. The curtain in the distant, unseen kitchen window of the Airstream trembled again, just once, as if in anticipation. Karina's hand, trembling, began to rise from her lap. The scent deepened, pulling threads from a place she had walled off years ago. Not just the sawdust, but the particular tune her father would whistle, off-key and meandering, as he planed a piece of pine. The feel of the cool concrete floor under her bare feet. The certainty that he was there just an arm's length away, and that nothing bad could happen in that small, sunlit garage. The memory was a warm bath, and the diner was so very, very cold. Her fingertips brushed the smooth ceramic of the mug. It was hot, almost too hot, a living heat, a contrast to the dead, conditioned air. She wrapped her hand around it, not to drink, but to feel that vital warmth seep into her bones. Kara's posture shifted, a subtle leaning forward. The storm in her eyes seemed to brighten. Karina looked past the steam, into the black, oil-slick surface of a liquid. For a second, she thought she saw a glimmer, not a reflection, but a scene. A sliver of golden afternoon light cutting across a workbench. Her breath hitched. It would be so easy to let go, to fall into that sunbeam and stay there forever. Jace was gone. The world outside was a conveyor belt to nowhere. What did she have to return to? Her other hand, still in her lap, closed into a fist. Her nails bit into her palm. A sharp, present pain. It was a tiny anchor. She thought of Jace's face, not as it was now, empty, but as it had been in the car just hours ago, annoyed and alive, arguing about the playlist. A real memory, flawed and fleeting. Not this perfect, stolen echo. If she drank, that argument would be lost forever. It would be smoothed away into the single, curated memory they would take from her. They would label it Father's Workshop and shelve it, and she would sit in a chair, humming with a joy she could no longer feel, only project. They would have her, but they would not have that argument. They would not have the memory of her mother's laugh, or the sting of her first heartbreak, or the weary, complicated love for the man now lost in a summer that never ended. They would have only one note, played on repeat, while the symphony of her life was dismantled and stored in a white mug. She would not give it to them. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the mug back to the table. She pushed it away, towards the center. The sound of the ceramic scraping on formica was obscenely loud in the hushed room. Kara's pleasant mask did not slip, but it hardened like plaster setting. The hunger in her eyes did not diminish. It sharpened, focused. "That is unwise," she said, her radio announcer voice gaining a faint, metallic edge. "The offer is not indefinite. The world outside has moved on. The path is no longer where you left it." "I'll take my chances," Karina said. Her voice was stronger than she felt. "There are no chances out there," Kara replied. "Only corn and sky and the slow turning of the earth towards oblivion. Here there is permanence, a chosen moment held safe." "It's not holding," Karina said, standing up. Her legs felt like water. "It's stealing, and I'm leaving." She turned and walked towards the door. Her back tingled, expecting a touch, a grip, the sudden scent of vanilla and paper overwhelming her. But nothing happened. She reached the door, its chrome handle cold under her sweating palm. She pulled. It opened without a sound, just as it had before. The Indiana afternoon heat rushed in, a solid wall of damp air after the diner's chill. It smelled of life, of green growth and decay and distant rain. Real smells. She stepped out onto the swept gravel. She did not look back. She walked past the silent airstream and she saw it clearly now. Not a home, but a receptacle hooked to the diner by hidden cables, humming with the same low frequency. The curtain in its window hung still and dead. The gravel drive stretched ahead, flanked by the towering, whispering corn. But as Kara had warned, it was different. The weeds that had partially swallowed it were gone. The path was now perfectly clear, raked smooth, and it no longer curved towards the main road. It led straight into the wall of stalks. The corn had parted, forming a narrow green corridor that receded into a point of blinding white sky. There was no sign of their car, no sign of the rust-eaten eat sign, only the diner at her back and this new, impossible path ahead. Karina stood at the mouth of the green corridor. The corn whispered, not with the dry rustle of before, but with a soft, liquid sound, like many voices murmuring just below hear it. She felt the weight of the curator's gaze from the dark window of the echo. A choice: return to the cold comfort and the white mug, or walk into the whispering, changing world the diner had made around itself. She took a breath, filled her lungs with the real, complicated air, and stepped into the corn. The stalks closed behind her instantly, sealing off the view of the diner. The light turned green and dim. The corridor was perfectly straight, the floor hard-packed earth. She walked. She walked for what felt like miles, the same view repeating endlessly. The murmur in the corn sometimes sounding like JC's laugh, sometimes like her father's whistle, sometimes like a host of forgotten voices, all humming different. Happy to. Just as despair began to curl its roots around her heart, she saw a change. Ahead, the corridor ended, not in a field or a road, but in a small, familiar space. A garage. Sunlight slanted through a dusty window, illuminating motes of sawdust in the air. The smell of pine and oiled metal was overwhelming. At the workbench, his back to her, a man in a plaid shirt planed a piece of wood, whistling that off-key, meandering tune. Karina stopped, her blood turning to ice. It was perfect. It was her echo, rendered in terrifying detail, waiting for her just beyond the corn. From behind her, far back down the green tunnel but carried with impossible clarity, she heard Kara's smooth, satisfied voice. "Everyone finds their harbor eventually, dear, even if they have to walk through hell to get to it." Story 6. The first thing Ivan noticed, the thing that truly frightened him, was not the sneezing. It was the silence that followed it. Not the ordinary silence of a room after a sudden noise, but a deep, swallowing quiet. As if the world had taken a step back and was holding its breath. The explosive, body-racking convulsion would tear through him. Ah! Chew. A sound so violent it felt like it might invert his ribs. And then... nothing. No echo. No settling dust. The hum of the refrigerator in his small apartment would vanish. The distant sigh of traffic from the boulevard 3 blocks over would cease. Even the faint, ever-present tinnitus in his own ears would disappear, leaving a vacuum so absolute it had a texture, a cold, velvety density against his skin. It was an unsettling absence, a hole punched in reality that lasted just 3 or 4 seconds. But in that void, Ivan felt a profound and cellular loneliness, as if he had been briefly erased. He went to doctors. Allergists prescribed antihistamines that did nothing, and specialists peered into his sinuses and saw only pink, healthy tissue. A neurologist suggested stress. The sneezing fits came at random intervals, sometimes days apart, sometimes 3 in an hour. Each was preceded by a peculiar scent, a dry, papery smell like old libraries and crushed insects. Each was followed by that terrible, consumptive silence. Then came the dreams, not nightmares of monsters or chases, but dreams of exquisite, unbearable sadness. He would dream of standing in a sun-drenched field, his mother's hand in his, a feeling of perfect childhood peace, only to look down and see his own adult hands, and know the moment was a memory, dead and unreachable. The loss so acute, he would wake with tears cooling on his temples. He dreamed of forgotten birthdays, of missed trains carrying loved ones away forever, of a single beautiful song heard once and then lost to time. The sadness did not fade upon waking. It lingered like a taste, a patina on his whole world, turning coffee bitter and sunlight gray. His primary care physician, concerned by Ivan's weight loss and the haunted look in his eyes, referred him to Dr. Camilla Vance. Camilla was not an allergist, but an immunologist with a research interest in atypical inflammatory responses. She listened to Ivan's story in her quiet, book-lined office, her gaze sharp and unwavering. She did not dismiss the silence. She called it a reported perceptual anomaly and noted it down with serious intent. It was the detail about the scent, the papery insect smell, that made her still her pen. "I'd like to run a different kind of test," she said, her voice low and confidential, as if sharing a secret. A deep nasal lavage and a cerebrospinal fluid tap. What you're describing, the neurological symptoms, the profound affective shift, it doesn't fit an allergen. It fits something that talks to your nervous system. The procedure was uncomfortable. The results, when they came, were incomprehensible. Camilla stared at the high-resolution microscopy displays in her lab, the sterile white light glinting off the screens. In the sample of Ivan's spinal fluid moving among the ordinary cells were things that should not exist. They were nanoscale, complex, almost beautiful in their sinister architecture. They looked like dandelion seeds wrought in obsidian or microscopic sea urchins with filaments finer than spider silk. They were not inert. They pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent rhythm, a soft, sickly yellow-green. Her own lab's air filtration system emitted a gentle, nearly subsonic thrum, but as she watched the creatures drift across the screen, she realized the sound had stopped. A perfect, cottony silence filled the room. She felt, just for a moment, a wave of despair so deep it buckled her knees, a memory of her failed marriage. The crushing certainty that she would die alone in a room just like this, her life's work amounting to nothing but dust on a screen. She broke the gaze, gasping. The hum of the filters returned. The despair receded, leaving a cold sweat on her neck. This was not a disease. This was an infestation, an engineered one. Her research became an obsession, conducted in secrecy, after hours. The organisms which she dubbed melancholites were impossibly sophisticated. They bypassed the immune system by mimicking neural sheathing. They traveled along the olfactory nerve directly into the brain, lodging in the limbic system, the seat of emotion and memory. Their function was horrifyingly simple. They amplified the perception of loss. Every minor regret became a canyon of sorrow. Every past joy was filtered through the lens of its inevitable passing. They did not cause hallucinations. They poisoned a memory and emotion at the source. And Ivan's sneezes, they were the reproductive cycle. In those moments of violent expulsion, in the absolute silence they created, a silence she theorized was a localized reality warping effect to facilitate transmission. The melancholites were released into the air as an aerosol, seeking new hosts. A biological weapon designed not to kill the body, but to murder happiness in perpetuity. The trail of the research led her to a dead end, and then to a name. Project Lament. Buried in defunct military grant proposals was a single redacted principal investigator, Dr. Deshawn Reed. Tracking him led to a long-term psychiatric care facility on the outskirts of the city. A place of soft beige walls and muffled sounds. The air inside smelled of antiseptic and boiled vegetables, a blandness that failed to mask a deeper odor of despair. Deshawn was a man in his 70s, sitting by a window overlooking a barren courtyard. He did not look like a monster. He looked empty. His file listed his condition as severe, treatment-resistant catatonic depression. Camila sat beside him, speaking softly. She did not mention the organisms. She spoke of theoretical immunology, of the poetry of cellular communication. For an hour, he gave no sign he heard her. Then, as a nurse's muted footsteps faded down the hall, he spoke, his voice a dry rustle. "They wanted a weapon that left infrastructure intact," he whispered, his eyes still on the dead grass outside. "A weapon against morale, against the will to resist, to make a population simply give up." I showed them my designs. They called it elegant. A tear traced a path through the fine wrinkles on his cheek, but his face remained expressionless. I was proud, so proud. The containment protocol failed. A single aerosolized leak. I was the first breath it took. He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were the most terrible thing she had ever seen. Windows into a universe where every star had gone out. The silence it makes, that's the sound of it eating the noise of the world. The joy, the meaning, it leaves only the echo of what's been lost. I built the key, and then I became the lock. Camila understood then. Deshawn wasn't patient zero. He was the factory. His chronic low-grade exposure had turned him into a permanent silent incubator, weeping the organisms slowly, steadily, into the facility's ventilation, affecting staff, other patients visit. A slow-motion apathy bomb. And Ivan, with his violent episodic fits, was a new, more efficient vector. A super spreader of sorrow. She raced back to her office to call Ivan, to quarantine him, to warn someone. But the city had changed. It was subtle. The lights seemed tired, falling flat on the streets. People moved with a slow, shuffling gait, their faces not angry or sad, just profoundly disinterested. Car horns sounded less frequently. No one laughed. The world was becoming muffled, softened under a blanket of invisible grief. Ivan was in his apartment, standing in the middle of his living room. He had not slept in days. The fits were coming every few minutes now. Each sneeze was a detonation of agony, each subsequent silence longer, deeper, more filled with the whispering of all his life's regrets. He could smell a papery insect scent constantly. He knew Camila was trying to reach him. He saw her name on his buzzing phone, a tiny, frantic beacon of purpose in the drowning gray. But a deeper knowledge had settled in him, a gift from the things nesting in his brain. He saw the network. He felt Deschamps' constant, low broadcast of despair from the facility. He felt the new, fragile connections flowering across the city from his own violent expulsions. He was a node in a growing silent web of unhappiness. Camila arrived, pounding on his door. He let her in. She looked frantic, alive. A burst of glorious, fearful color in his gray world. She began speaking, rapid and urgent, about weapons, about Deschamps, about containment. He listened, and her words were beautiful and terrible, because he could feel the hope in them. And hope was now the most painful thing he could perceive. It was a future loss waiting to happen. "Even we can fight this," she said, gripping his arms. "We can find an inhibitor, a way to communicate with the immune system." He had a fit then. It bent him double. A seismic shock that felt like it would tear his soul from his body. June. The silence that followed was not 3 seconds. It was 10, 20. The world was utterly gone. There was no room, no city, no Camila. There was only a vast cosmic loneliness and the crushing weight of every beautiful thing that had ever died. In that silence, he saw the truth of the melancholy's design. It didn't just spread unhappiness. It spread the perception that happiness had always been an illusion, a fragile lie told against the void. And the void was the only truth. When the sound rushed back, Camila's gasp, the creak of the floor, he knew what he had to do. The web was in him. He could feel its threads. To break one node might destabilize the whole nascent network. Deschamps, the primary broadcaster, was too fortified, too saturated. But he, Ivan, the secondary vector, was still volatile. He looked at Camila, her eyes wide with scientific fury and human fear. He gave her a smile then, the first real smile he had managed in weeks, and it was full of an ancient, heartbreaking kindness. "It's in the silence," he said, his voice calm. "That's where it lives. Don't listen to the silence, Camila." Before she could move, he turned and ran for the window. It was not an act of suicide. It was a severance, a critical failure in the circuit. He crashed through the glass into the cool evening air, and as he fell, he had one final, colossal sneeze. It was not a sound. It was a negation. A wave of absolute, consuming quiet erupted from his body, a bubble of void that swallowed the street noise, the sirens in the distance, the very wind. And within that expanding sphere of silence, for one infinitesimal moment, the psychic shockwave of his choice, a choice of defiant, self-annihilating agency, reverberated back through the web. In her lab, Deschamps Reed, staring at his courtyard, let out a small, shuddering sigh, and stopped. In the street, Camila, kneeling beside the ruin of Ivan, felt the world become startlingly, painfully vivid. The sound of her own weeping was sharp and clear. The taste of copper in her mouth from bitten lip was intense. The feeling of loss was gargantuan, but it was her loss, clean and sharp and human, not the engineered, cosmic despair of the weapon. Oh, the muffled quality of the world had lifted. The web had flickered. The authorities came. They took Evan's body. They sealed Camilla's lab but die. Project Lament was buried deeper under layers of classification and disbelief. The city, over the following weeks, slowly began to sound like itself again. People argued on street corners. A child laughed at a balloon. The pervasive gloom retreated, attributed to a passing collective mood, a strange atmospheric pressure. Camilla survived. She changed her name, left the city, but she could not leave the knowledge. She would sometimes, in a quiet room, think she caught a hint of a dry, papery smell. She would freeze, waiting for the silence to descend. It never did. Not fully. Years later, she lived in a small house by a great lake. She kept few possessions. On the mantelpiece in her bare living room, there's a single object. It is a small, clear glass vial, sealed with a wax plug. Inside it is a sample of dust and dried fluid from the floor of Ivan's apartment, collected before the men in unmarked suits could clean it. Within that dust, dormant but perhaps not dead, are the obsidian dandelion seeds of the melancholy. It catches the light sometimes. It is a key to a terrible door. It is a lock against a forgetting she dares not allow. It is a candle that does not burn, a stopped clock that marks the moment the world almost forgot how to feel joy. She will never open it. She will never destroy it. She simply watches it as the long, quiet afternoons pass, and the waves of the lake outside make their endless sighing sound, a sound that has not yet been stolen by the silence. The lake's sigh was her constant companion. It was a natural silence, a porous one, filled with a rustle of reeds and the cry of gulls. It did not swallow. It held. Camilla, now Lena to her neighbors, would sit on her porch in the evenings and listen to it, testing the edges of her own mind for any dullness, any creeping gray. Her vigilance was her penance. She worked as a consultant for online medical journals under layers of encryption. Her expertise funneled into benign channels. But her real work was done in the cellar of the little house, a space sealed with airtight doors and its own independent air supply. There, under gentle blue light, she kept her instruments. And the vial. She had not been idle. The sample had yielded secrets, slowly, grudgingly. The melancholites were in a state of profound stasis, but they were not inert. They responded to specific frequencies of sound, vibrations that mimicked the neural oscillations of a grieving brain. They were, she confirmed, engineered to be communicators, building a network of shared despair. Ivan's final act had been a massive feedback pulse, a scream of agency into the web that had temporarily stunned the network. It had silenced Deshawn, the primary hub. But networks could reroute. Hubs could be replaced. Her fear was not that they would return. It was that they had never left, that they were simply dormant, waiting for the right conditions, the right resonance of collective sorrow. A pandemic, a war, a slow collapse. Any of these could be the catalyst that woke them from their sleep in the dust of the world. One evening, the lake was peculiarly still. The sigh had faded to a whisper, then to nothing. Camilla felt the old coldness in her veins. She went inside, not to the living room, but down to the cellar. She placed the violin in a containment unit and activated a scanner she had built, a device designed to detect the faint bioluminescent pulse of the organisms. The screen remained dark, The vial was quiet, but as she turned to go, a notification pinged on her secure terminal upstairs. It was an automated alert from a web crawler she had set years ago, searching for specific obscure symptom clusters. A new pattern had emerged, flagged from a cluster of small towns 200 miles south. Reports of a wasting grief, sudden onset apathy, and a curious detail. Patients reporting a temporary profound deafness following episodes of intense emotion. Not sneezing, weeping. They had adapted. The transmission vector had changed. Camila's eyes went to the vial. The glass seemed to glow in the dim cellar light. Not with its own light, but with the reflection of her dread. Ivan had broken one web, but the spores were in the wind, and they had found new soil. They were learning. She shut down the cellar, the seals hissing softly. Upstairs, she packed a small bag with medical gear, scanners, and a case containing a single experimental anti-resonance emitter she had been developing in secret. It was untested. It might do nothing, or it might, like Ivan's final act, shout into the growing silence. She drove south through the gathering night. The headlights cut through a darkness that felt thicker than it should. She did not look back at the house on the lake. She knew she might never return. The vial on the mantelpiece was no longer just a reminder. It was a beacon, and she was following its silent, desperate call into the heart of a quiet that was once again beginning to spread. The towns huddled under the same pale moon, but the air felt different as she crossed the county line. It was not the oppressive silence yet, but a hush, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. Streetlights pooled on empty sidewalks. A lone dog barked, the sound sharp and strangely truncated, then ceased abruptly. Her first stop was a clinic in the town of Bales Creek. The night nurse, a woman with shadows like bruises under her eyes, spoke in a monotone. "It's like a sleeping sickness, but they're awake. They just don't care." Mrs. Elkins over on Sycamore lost her son to a tractor accident last fall. Took it hard, but she was coping. Then last week, she just stopped. She'll sit and stare at the wall for hours. She says the world's gone quiet. She says is a relief. The nurse's own voice was devoid of relief. It was flat, a stone skipping on a tar pit. Camila asked about the deafness. The nurse nodded slowly. "Old Mr. Henderson. He got the news about his diagnosis. Started crying, they say, which he never did. Mid-sob, he just clapped his hands over his ears. Said everything went mute for a full minute. When it came back, he was like the others. Empty. He was like the others. Empty." It was a confirmation. The melancholites were not just airborne. They were leveraging the body's own emotional extremes, using the neurochemical surge of profound sadness as an activation trigger and a transmission moment. Weeping, screaming, any paroxysmal release of grief could now be a vector. It was more insidious, more intimate than a sneeze. She found Mrs. Elkins' house. Through the window, she saw the woman sitting in a chair, her face turned toward a blank television screen. Camila's scanner, pointed from the street, registered a faint, familiar bioluminescent signature. It was weak, diffuse. This was not a concentrated infestation like Ivan's. It was a slow seep, a gentle poisoning of the emotional well. Her emitter was a clumsy thing, a box of circuits and a parabolic dish. It was designed to broadcast a counter-frequency, a sequence of resonant pulses meant to disrupt the melancholites' communication. She set it up on the roof of her car, aimed at the house, and activated it. A low thrum, barely audible to human ears, emanated from the device. For a moment, nothing. Then Mrs. Elkins shifted in her chair. Her head turned, not toward the window, but toward a photograph on the mantelpiece. A young man with a wide, smiling face. Her expression did not change, but a single fat tear rolled down her cheek. It was not the tear of engineered despair. It was a specific, human grief. sharp and pointed. The scanner flickered. The signature dimmed. It was working. Not a cure, but an interruption. A temporary clearing of the static. But as she drove to the next town, a deeper horror dawned. This adaptation meant the weapon was no longer an accident, a leak from a single source. It was evolving in the wild. It was finding the most vulnerable moments in human experience, mourning, trauma, shock, and using them as doors. Every funeral, every hospital waiting room, every lonely kitchen table could be a ground zero. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. It was from a source she thought had gone dark years ago, a colleague from her old life who had asked no questions when she disappeared. The message was brief. Patterns matching your parameters emerging in urban centers. Low incidence, high density. Linked to public tragedies, memorial sites. They were targeting gatherings of grief. They were harvesting sorrow en masse. Camila pulled over to the side of the empty road. The emitter sat on the passenger seat, still warm. It was a pebble against a tide. Ivan's sacrifice had been a scalpel, cutting a single thread. This was a flood. She thought of the vial in her cellar, dormant but potent. A key. Her work had always been predicated on the assumption that the melancholite was a lock to be picked. But what if it was also an invitation? To understand a thing that communicates through shared despair, one must listen to its language. Truly listen. A terrible, calm resolution settled over her. The scientific part of her recoiled. The human part, the part that remembered Ivan's smile before he fell, understood. She would not just fight the silence. She would have to enter it. To use the vial not as a sample, but as a seed. To inoculate herself with a controlled, measured dose. To let the network connect to her. And from within its own terrible architecture, to try to rewrite the message. It was madness. It was suicide. It was, perhaps, the only way to learn the grammar of the weapon well enough to compose a new ending. She turned the car around, not toward the next infected town, but back toward the lake, toward the cellar, toward the key, and the lock. The night was vast and quiet around her, but now she was not running from the silence. She was driving straight into its heart, hoping to find, in the ruins of all that was lost, a note she could still sing. Thank you for making it all the way to the end, and for joining me on another journey through our nighttime scary stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tales, and to help our channel grow. Wishing you a calm, peaceful good night, and I'll see you tomorrow with a brand new story.